What does it really mean to belong to a nation? It's one of the most powerful identities we have. I mean, it can bind millions of strangers together, but it can also be used to justify exclusion, conflict, and just unimaginable violence. So, how does that pride in who we are unravel into war against them? Okay, let's get into it. Just look at this scene from Hungary. You can almost feel the energy, right? The passion, the unity. Thousands of people, all brought together by this shared identity, waving the national flag. This is the power of nationalism in action. But what's the story here? What's really driving all that loyalty?
So, get this. After winning a huge election, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban didn't just talk about policy. He called the victory an opportunity to defend Hungary. I mean, that's a really powerful way to frame it. But it makes you wonder, right? And this is the big question for us today. Defended from what? Or from who?
All right, so to even begin to answer that, we've got to back up a little. We need to get a handle on what a nation even is and why it has such a powerful grip on us.
Okay, so the textbook definition is pretty straightforward. A group of people, common history, culture, you get the idea. But the really cool concept comes from a political scientist named Benedict Anderson. He called the nation an imagined community. And just think about that for a second. You'll never meet most of the people in your own country, not even close. But you still feel this deep connection, right? Like you're all in it together? That feeling? It's all in our heads. It's imagined. But wow, is its power real?
So, where did this whole idea of a nation even come from? Well, surprise, surprise, the experts don't agree. On one side, you've got Ernest Gellner. He says nationalism is pretty new, a modern thing. It basically came about because of industrialism. You needed a workforce that could move around, read, and all speak the same language. Makes sense. But then you have Anthony Smith, and he says, whoa, not so fast. He argues it goes way, way deeper, back to what he calls ethnies. Think of these as ancient ethnic groups with shared ancestors and a deep tie to their homeland. So whether it's an old idea or a new one thing's for sure, nationalism is amazing at creating an us. But here's where it gets dangerous. The trouble starts when that feeling of us is built by pointing fingers at a them. Okay, let's bring it back to Hungary and see this in action. Remember that question, defended from who? Well, the Fidesz party had an answer, or rather a whole list of answers. They built this whole story by pointing out threats. You had the external colonizers like the EU, a really strong anti-immigration stance, and they played on this old feeling that Hungary has been a victim throughout history. I mean, it's the classic playbook, right? You create a strong us by defining a very clear them. And look at this. This number shows you it's not just talk. By 2016, a whopping 72% of Hungarians had negative views of Muslims. Now, to give you some context, the average across the rest of the EU was 43%. That is a huge difference. It just goes to show how powerful these stories can be in shaping how people see the world. And when that us versus them thinking really takes over, it doesn't just stay as an idea. It leads to real physical things, like walls. This piece by Banksy, it's painted on the actual security wall between Israel and Palestine. It's about as literal as you can get, a concrete symbol of a conflict built on two competing national stories, fighting over the same piece of land. So, in the worst-case scenarios, all this tension boils over into actual organized violence, into war. But what even is war when you really break it down? Is it just total chaos, or is there some kind of logic behind it all? Well, the classic place to start is with this famous quote from a Prussian military guy, Karl von Clausewitz. Now, the key thing to get here is that he didn't think war was what happens when politics fails. Nope. He saw it as just another part of politics, another tool in the toolbox, a calculated move a country makes when talking doesn't work anymore. He had this idea of a trinity of war. He said you need three things. First, the government needs a political goal. Second, you need the generals with their plans and strategies. And third, and this is so important, you need the passion of the people, their anger and hostility. For him, you couldn't have a war without all three of those pieces working together. But then, something changed. Something got twisted. In the modern era, there was this really dark shift. See, old-school warfare had some so-called rules. You were supposed to fight the other army. But the 20th century, that gave us what some called degenerate war. And that's where civilians aren't just getting caught in the crossfire anymore. They're the actual target, on purpose. And that horrifying idea, it reached its absolute worst point during the Holocaust. A sociologist named Zygmunt Bauman made this really chilling point about it. He said the Holocaust wasn't some step backward into a dark, primitive age. Quite the opposite. He argued it was a product of modernity itself, a terrifyingly modern event. Think about it. According to Bauman, it was all the stuff we think of as progress that made it possible. Technology made mass killing efficient, like a factory. Bureaucracy, all the paperwork and systems, it turned human beings into numbers, making it easier for people to just do their job without feeling responsible. You mix that with a hateful, racist ideology and a state that can do whatever it wants, and you get the recipe for something truly monstrous. So that was the awful logic of that kind of industrial-scale war. But what about now? We live in this super interconnected, globalized world. What does war look like today? Well, guess what? It's changing again. A scholar named Mary Calder has a really useful way to think about this. She talks about old wars versus new wars. Your old wars, that's what we typically think of. Countries fighting countries, usually for land. There's a pretty clear line between soldiers and civilians. But new wars are different. They're messy, they're fought by militias, warlords, all sorts of groups, and not just within borders. The line between war and just organized crime gets super blurry. And guess who the main targets are? Yep, civilians all over again. So, with these incredibly messy, complicated new kinds of conflicts, how do you even begin to find a way out? I mean, what does that fragile journey from war back to peace even look like? Well, it's usually a really long process with a few key phases. It often kicks off with super secret talks, just to see if a real negotiation is even possible. If that goes well, you might get a ceasefire, an end to the fighting. Then comes the really hard part, the actual political negotiations. But you know what? Even if they sign a piece of paper, the work is far from over. The hardest part of all is what comes next, the long, slow process of actually rebuilding and healing a society. And it's important to remember that peace isn't just one thing. It can look totally different depending on how the conflict ends. A sociologist, John Brewer, laid out three main types. First, you have conquest. That's simple, one side just wins, period. Then there's cartography, which is a fancy way of saying you redraw the maps to keep the two sides apart. But the toughest one, by far, is compromise. That's where the two sides have to figure out how to live together, side by side after everything that's happened. And that leads us to a final, really critical point. There's something called negative peace and something called positive peace. Negative peace is just the absence of violence. The guns have gone silent. But positive peace is so much more. It's when you actually fix the unfairness and the problems that started the war in the first place. Because if you don't get to positive peace, all that anger and tension, it's just sitting there, right under the surface, ready to boil over again. So, when you put it all together, we've seen that the whole idea of a nation is this incredibly powerful thing that we made up. And we've seen how war has morphed from a political game into this messy global thing where ordinary people are the main victims. So it leaves us with this one big question to chew on. In a world that's changing so fast, what new imagined communities are we going to create? And what will we be willing to fight for and against in the years to come?